essentially, trauma is the body responding to a perceived threat. So going into the nervous system, going into fight or flight, defaulting into freeze, and then staying there.
It's like taking that what's weighed us down and turn that into our gifts, into our magic, into the gifts that we bring to the world and what we use to make a difference in the world.
And specifically with sexual trauma, it actually gets stored within your sexual organs.
The body doesn't understand those words. It doesn't understand those thought processes because it is in that emotional hangover of the past experience.
You know, your logical sense of safety is going to be different from yours.
Welcome to the Authentic Man podcast. I am your host, David Chambers. This is a podcast for men who want more and less from life. More deep connection, more emotional intelligence, more self-awareness, and more great sex. And less heartache, less conflict, less overthinking, and less stress. Creating dating lives, sex lives, and relationships that are incredible and authentic. My deepest goal is that you, the listener, can take away what you hear in this podcast and apply it to your life so that you can experience greater happiness, transformational growth, deeper relationships, and profound sexual intimacy. I believe that as men, we are capable of so much more depth than we are shown or led to believe. So join me as we get deep into this. Welcome back to another wonderful episode of the Authentic Man podcast. I'm your host, David Chambers, and I today have had a most insightful, beautiful, and transformational conversation around today's topic, which is really how men can be in relationship, whether that's intimate relationship or sexual relationship with women that have experienced sexual trauma. It's a big topic, and I think a topic that's not talked about enough. There's not much of a coming together for men to understand, but actually men to understand from a compassionate point of view, not from a you've done this thing to women and you're bad, but actually like how can we come together and how can we connect? What do we need to know? How do we need to talk? How do we need to listen? And it's an incredible conversation, really inspiring conversation with two wonderful women, Amy and Amelia, who I've known for a long time through my journey of podcasting and doing my own work and doing this work. And, you know, if you're a man listening to this, it's like they have such deep compassion and desire for understanding of men. And there's times we touch on that, actually, the difficulty for men of actually being with a woman who has experienced sexual trauma and how there can be a lot to hold and a lot to be with. So that's also contained in there. Obviously, we talk a lot about what sexual trauma is and how it shows up in our relationships and our sexual interactions, how a man can spot these signs, how he can react to these signs to help foster more connection and depth. We talk a lot about safety and what safety is and how we can find kind of safety in our own bodies as well. We talk about conversational and communication structures that you can use to, you know, get to and understand like what your partner's been through. We also talk about consent and how we can make consent sexy and fun and add to the moment. We talk about the myth of spontaneous sex and our desire for spontaneity and why that can be quite negative often as well. There's a lot in here. There's a lot of talking about how we can create sexual experiences that are more connecting. So yeah, I just, you know, if you're listening to this, if you are a woman listening to this, and it's almost one of those episodes, if you've experienced sexual trauma, you want to send this to your husband, or you want to send this to your boyfriend, or you might want to send it to your brother. So please do share this episode because it really will aid men who are striving to be better men, want to be great men, in connecting with women and connecting with their partners as well. But without further ado, I'll let you get into the episode. This is an episode that I've been looking forward to. It's the first time in a long time that I've had two guests on at the same time. The two wonderful women who I've known for a long time through my journey of podcasting, pretty much from the early days of our podcast, before it was called The Authentic Man. I have today with me Amelia and Amy. How
Very
are you guys
welcome.
doing?
So good to be here with two of my favourite people.
Yeah, I actually, in this very moment, feel quite giddy and giggly because of our recording chat, which is actually quite a nice feeling, nice energy.
Yeah, it was wonderful to connect with the two of you at the same time. It's the first time we've had a conversation, the three of us together, which is really beautiful to have. Really beautiful to have. So I want to start off so the listeners, they get a feel for you and your work. I'd love the two of you to introduce yourself. Whoever wants to go first goes first.
Yeah, I can go first. So I'm Amy, and I'm the founder of Temple of the Feminine. So that's my brand, the umbrella that I work under, my creation. And the work that I do, my kind of work title changes from time to time, but essentially my expertise is in female sexuality from a more holistic space, and that includes embodiment, trauma, understanding, anatomy, pleasure, and the esoteric as well.
Hi, my name is Amelia, and I am in a transition phase at the moment, but for the last 3 years I've been working as a sexual healer in London, and my passion is creating safe and sacred spaces for people to come home to their body, their pleasure and their sexuality. And at the moment I'm transitioning into a facilitator role because I want to do more group facilitation experiences, but I've really been to the depths of the darkness with clients who have been navigating the quagmire of hell that is sexual trauma, and when it isn't, when it's causing challenges and discomfort in their life. And my approach is probably leaning towards more spiritual than like physiological, and I've seen amazing results from that. And so I'm really looking forward to explore this conversation and to shine some light.
And this is why, I contacted these two wonderful women to discuss this incredibly delicate topic, right, of sexual trauma and how we, as men, can be in relationship with women that have experienced sexual trauma, because it's a very difficult topic, very difficult to navigate, and we'll talk more about that through our conversation today. But also would love to know from the two of you what your journey was to do the work that you do now. I know there's always an interesting journey that people go through to get to the work that they do now.
I can go first. So I came to this work through actually being very traumatized myself in relation to sex and intimacy and pleasure and my body. And I came to a point where I was celibate for 4 years and was just completely disconnected. I was very much on a yogic path, and I was hanging around in the upper chakras and having a lovely time, but really disassociated from my body. And having had a lot of trauma in my 20s, lots of sex, drugs, and sort of unconsciousness. And then, like, the universe just basically didn't give me any other option but to go down this path. And the massive amounts of transformation and healing and connection to myself, I feel just like a completely different person, having integrated the top and the bottom. And it's now just a really big passion of mine, especially with women who have experienced maybe disordered eating or real disconnection to their body. I feel like sex and pleasure and intimacy can be such a powerful and radical way of healing that. And so that what brings me here today to share this work is like a really personal experience of it, of trauma and disconnection and fear and an inability to communicate my needs and my experiences, which are really important. And yeah, I'll leave it there.
It's lovely hearing your journey, Amelia, even though I know you so well. And I just feel, there's some similarities. And I think what's quite coming up for me in terms of what I want to share about my journey is that up until I kind of like went into the healing space, I probably would have told you that I don't have any trauma and like, you know, nothing bad had ever happened to me. And it's like the way that we sort of justify or try and make sense of things that have happened is really important in understanding trauma, as we'll get into it, because it's still happening in the body, even if you're not on a mind level, you're not aware. So in a similar vein, I was on a spiritual path and, you know, just sort of finding myself. And when I say no trauma, I'm speaking about sexual trauma. So yeah, I was on a spiritual path, sort of meditation, positive thinking, manifestation, very much like just trying to kind of, you know, experience a better life, a more expansive life. And then it culminated in my mum passing away, which sort of propelled me into a bit of an existential crisis, really, and wanting to understand the meaning of life and death and spirit and that crossover, which led me to India, which led me to accidentally booking onto a Kundalini Tantra yoga teacher training. It's really important, this accidental. And one day I'll tell you these like divine synchronicities that led me there. But I did not know I was walking into a Kundalini yoga teacher training. I was like, just want to brush up on my down dog, you know, work on my alignment. And it is not that. And so I walked into like this room, everyone wearing white, having full body orgasms around a guru. And I had a sexual awakening. And it was like, wow, I'm just full of pleasure and energy and like, wow, this is amazing. And then I got back to the UK and was just sort of like watching my sexual energy run rife with all these relationships that were maybe not reflective of where I was going in this sort of spiritual path. I'll try and wrap it up. I took a year vow of celibacy and I dove into female sexuality and tantra within myself. Then came out of that and dove into interrelational tantra and sacred sexuality, full whack. And then burnt out a little bit and then started studying trauma. All along the way, I was bringing out my gifts as it were. It started as like women's circles and then it started to be like connecting to the body and pleasure. And now full spectrum, psychosexual, somatic therapy coach, tantric trained teacher. And yeah, I bring all of that and all of that experience and training to those that I work with.
Amazing. Magical. Really beautiful. You know, it's this, what I really get from both of your stories there is like, it's taking the kind of lead into the gold, you know, as they say, and I think it's the hero's journey. It's like taking that what's weighed us down and turn that into our gifts, into our magic, into the gifts that we bring to the world and what we use to make a difference in the world.
I'm endlessly inspired by the depth and the deep and the dark. Like, that's something I'm really embracing, that like that's where I feel like creative, that's where things feel rich, that's where I actually can expand. And when you and I'm not going to open this up too much, but when we understand like the relationship between like the pleasure and the pain body and that ability just to be in energy and feel and how deep you can go in that, you can expand into more sort of like richer and authentic, like orgasmic experiences of life also.
Yeah, I feel that. So as we journey today in this conversation, we're going to talk about sexual trauma and relationship and women and how men can be in relationship together. I thought we'd start with a definition to start with of what sexual trauma is. I'd love to maybe, Amelia, start with you. It's like, what do you see as your working definition of sexual trauma?
My definition of sexual trauma is an experience that happened to you that was too much, that you didn't have the capacity or the ability or the knowledge to be able to run that experience through your body. And as we see in animals in the wild, when they experience something that's too much, they're able to shake their body. Their body is able to naturally dispel the energy. And so what happens when an experience is too much for us, it gets stored in the body. And specifically with sexual trauma, it actually gets stored within your sexual organs. So, for example, like for women, it gets stored in the walls of their vagina. And so what will happen is that armor will build up within the walls of the vagina. And then on top of that, so there'll be a pain, there'll be a like a pain of the trauma, and then on top of that, there'll be numbness. And so these, I'm keeping it very, very simple, but it's basically an event that wasn't able to complete, that was too much for your system. And then we build these coping mechanisms to avoid experiencing that because it was too much. Like if in the moment you're able to shake or scream or run away or do any of those things, then the experience moves through the body. But what happens when we have sexual trauma is that we're so intimate with that person, and it could be something as simple as you're not ready to have sex, but you can't speak to that to your partner, so you shut down, and that's like a mini trauma and a small t. So we have small t trauma, and then we have big T trauma, which would be something bigger like rape, or they're both significant, but small t trauma has less of an impact than big T trauma. And so these experiences get stuck in our body, and then later on when we have experiences that mirror those experiences, this trauma can be activated. And it can have, so if you're with one partner and you have this traumatic experience, and then a couple of years later you're with a different partner and you have something that mimics that trauma can be activated, and there can be a response that can emerge. And so there's multiple different trauma responses that can happen when trauma is activated. But I don't know if we're going to go into that right now, but that's what I would say is my definition of trauma, when an overwhelming experience can't complete and is stored in the body.
Very comprehensive. I don't know, Amy, if you have anything, your working definition or anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I really just echo what Amelia said. And, this is a great question because there isn't like a uniform definition for trauma, right? And it's still quite a new area that's being explored. And it's not, it's where sort of Western medicine, because when we're talking about sexual trauma, we're talking, although it's a physical act, we are talking about like the emotional, the psychological, the physiological. And, where Western medicine's strengths are not in that, right? So they can deal with physical trauma, i.e. I broke my leg, but they're not kind of like exploring this area so much. So it's left to, other kind of people, minds and facilitators and teachers. So there's not a uniform definition. And I really, agree with everything Amelia said. And there's a brilliant woman called Rachel Maddox who is a really powerful woman in empowering women and in sexual trauma. And she describes it as an emotional hangover. And I really like that phrase and or that term, and would also add that it's not just the emotional, but the physiological. So you don't have to have a like conscious knowledge or conscious train of thought about it for the body to be holding trauma. And it's less about what's been done and how it's been experienced, right? So we can't really, although we might have ideas of like what is traumatic, it's how the body experiences it. And essentially trauma is the body responding to a perceived threat. So going into the nervous system, going into fight or flight, not being able to complete on that fight and flight, and probably like then defaulting into freeze and then staying there. Right? If that can be completed in the moment, and it doesn't matter what the traumatic act is, if it can be completed, then the long-term impacts of the trauma are going to be lesser, right? And what I mean by completed is that you're able to use that fight-flight energy, you're able to receive support, you're able to find resolution in various ways depending on what happened. But when you're not, and you're left with that experience and it stays in the body, you're holding a trauma memory. around that. And that can be, like Amelia said, activated so if you have a trauma memory around sex and around pleasure, you may then, that memory will be activated when you're met with any experience of sex and pleasure, right? Your body may just be frozen or stuck, or it may sort of ignite that fight flight when we meet, that sex, because sex and pleasure becomes the perceived danger. And it's perceived, right? Because we know that, there'll be the context, in different contexts, these things aren't dangerous, but it's the body speaking, right? It's like that book, The Body Holds the Score. We can't really think our way out of trauma. It's a physiological embodied response.
I think that's something that I'd really love to just highlight is with trauma is it's not something that can be thought out of. It's not something that you can rationally go, well, this situation isn't the same as the past situation, so I can just get over it, because the experiences is happening in the body. So there needs to be a somatic way of working with the trauma response that is through a number of different ways. But I think that's just something, when I was going through my healing journey, I was just so frustrated because I was like, I know that I can't, I know that I'm safe with this person, but why is my body not allowing me to, like, why can I not think it free? And it wasn't until I learned about somatics and like actually giving my body like the embodied experience of safety and being able to communicate what I was experiencing with my partner, which requires a lot of safety. And I think we're going to talk a lot in this conversation about creating safety, because that is what trauma requires, is safety.
And it's, just to add to that, it's not, your logical sense of safety is going to be different from your embodied sense of safety. So what you might need, so I know Amelia said that on a logical level, yeah, this person is safe, but on a body level, they're not. And it might be that they're not being very present, or they've said something that's left a lingering trigger within you, or they're not hearing something that you've asked, or there's very, very subtleties that the body will pick up on, that on a logical level you're like, well, this person is not going to pin me down and hurt me. But on the body level, there's a sensitivity that's needed that the person in that body has to understand first and foremost and be able to communicate. But what the mind understands as safe is separate from, and when I say the mind, like the conscious, our logical thought process, is different from what the body perceives as safe.
And I love what you said, Amy, earlier about the emotional hangover, because and then I think you went on to say, it's like, it's not what happens, right? It's what the experience is, what the story is of the experience that really affects us going forward. And I think, as you touched on there, Amelia, as well, it's like you can't think your way out of it, as much as a person might come to you and be like, oh, but you, as you said about yourself, Amelia, it's like, oh, I know that this person I'm with is safe and they're good and they want to treat me well, but the body doesn't understand those words. It doesn't understand those thought processes, because it is in that emotional hangover of the past experience. And I guess this leads into the question I was thinking, which has kind of slightly been answered, but maybe there's a little bit more there, is like, what are the effects, right, on somebody, right, especially in terms of relationships and sex and intimacy, if you've had an experience that's left a mark of sexual trauma on you? Maybe I'll start with Amelia this time.
Let me just fit into this. I think, the effects that I see commonly within clients is a certain level of fawning. And a client who has experienced sexual trauma will be doing everything that they can to make their partner happy. They will overstep their own boundaries. They will not be able to attune to their system because they'll be wanting to make that other person happy. The other effects could be the opposite, could be a freeze response, a disinterest in sex, making up excuses, not wanting to engage intimately, be very uninterested. And then there also could be a hypersexuality, like wanting to have sex all the time and not engaging through the heart, just wanting it being just an experience just to get it done, or just to kind of get that dopamine hit and not really tune into where their body is at that time. And I suppose those are kind of the indications, and the effects can be. I mean, there's hundreds of effects of sexual trauma, but I'd love to hear from Amy, like what you would say to this, because you have a different avenue of experience.
Yeah, and I think, where we're just sort of leading on from that notion of like it coming from the body, like where sexual trauma may be slightly different in the sense of, when we have sexual trauma, when we have sex, what we want to experience is pleasure and intimacy and orgasm, right? And sexual trauma can actually suppress our ability to connect to pleasure and orgasm and block our ability to experience intimacy. And, so it can feel like, the body can feel numb. We can start to disassociate from the body because it's full of trauma. It doesn't feel like a good place to be. So be very in the head when you're having sex, enduring sex, getting through it, thinking our way out of it, like getting lost in fantasy can be a kind of symptom. And all of these things can exist on some level at all times in everyone. But I also want to add that I think we need to sort of, when we start to really understand trauma, we've all got some level of trauma. And, I speak for women, maybe David, you can speak more for men, but I would say, most women have experienced sexual trauma just by virtue of living in a culture where sex has been suppressed and shamed and distorted and all that sort of stuff. But yes, it can really impact our ability to feel ourselves. Right, if we think about this kind of like numb freeze experience, that's it's not just a concept. It's a experience in the body. And you think about freeze, it's like everything's just stuck, frozen. And so that energy, when you understand sexual energy, is like moving and flowing and open and expansive. If the body's in freeze, there's nowhere for it to go. And so it can, one of the huge symptoms that I know is like disconnection from the body, feeling numbed out to pleasure, feeling numb from the waist down. And another one as well to add, because I know Amelia covered a lot of really key things, is like, this is where we get like in this really chewy space, because someone who has experienced trauma, sexual trauma, is likely to find it difficult to speak up, because that freeze, if you think freeze just kind of locks everything. And if you add like shame is like quite a traumatic emotion, experience in the body. Like, shame and freeze just locks everything down. If you understand someone's in freeze, they're going to be very easily say, I'm fine, when they're absolutely not fine. And you're not going to be able to see that they're not fine, right? Because it's going to be such a well-versed way of coping and the way of living in the world, to present as everything's fine when inside the body, and that person may not even know what's going on, because the coping mechanism is to disassociate from what's happening in the body. So there is a lot of complexities there. But yeah, on that sexual level, like a numb out, a disassociation, and being able to communicate in the moment, being able to speak up in the moment, that's really challenging for most people. And those that have experienced sexual trauma are going to have potentially like have their voice locked down as well. I'd like to speak
to that actually. Just touch on a personal experience that I had actually not that long ago. And I'm a practitioner, and I've been doing this work for a long time, and I know my body, and I'm able to use my words. And a few months ago, I was in a situation where some old trauma was reactivated, and I couldn't use my voice. And then I went into fawn, and I actually spoke to Amy, and she held this really like important mirror up to me, and she was reflecting that I was fawning and that I was in a trauma response because my boundaries had been overstepped. And so it's not something, and it's not something that is like, it can happen at any time, at any level of experience. And I was shocked that this happened to me because and there was a bit of shame that came up because I know all this stuff, but my body was in a trauma response. And so my logical brain, my prefrontal cortex had shut down and I couldn't use my words. And so this is why it's really important to understand the signs of when your partner might be experiencing trauma, because it was very, afterwards it was clear to me that I was in a trauma response, but in the time I kind of knew, but I couldn't, it was almost like I was frozen. I couldn't rationalize myself out of it. I had to kind of eventually manage to use my tools, but in the moment I was activated. And so I just wanted to share that as a little kind of anecdote from my experience, that it can be a very, it can be a very paralyzing experience when something is activated.
Thank you for sharing, Amelia. Amy, I could speak from a man's position of being receiving, of observing, and also taking in what the two of you have said. It's like there's a real spectrum, right, of how it can show up. Amelia, you talked about kind of hypersexualization, like wanting sex, wanting lots of sex, wanting it hard and fast. That's something I've seen in women that have experienced sexual trauma, of this almost like over fantasizing of sex, and it becomes this like thing to be done. It can be very heady, it can be very performative in many ways as well. And then, along the spectrum of being really terrified by the idea of even being near someone that might be feeling something sexual, right? And as a man in relationship, some of the signs of can be, like you said, not speaking up, like during sex, before any conversations around sex, like, what would you like? What would you enjoy? Just no knowledge of wants and desires as well is something that I've seen where, you're with a woman, you're like, oh, what would you really like? And it's just blankness. It's like, I don't know what I like. Or I've had women where I've said that to them and they've paused and they've got quite emotional because it's like, no one's ever asked me that question before. No one's ever asked me what I wanted or what I wanted to feel. And they're like, shit, I can have a thought about that. I can have an opinion about that. It isn't just something I'm just being done to me. So there's such a spectrum of signs, right? And I was kind of saying this for men more than anything, the men listening, is like there's such a spectrum of signs. It's not like, okay, if this thing happens and it means that she's experienced sexual trauma, because it can be extremely subtle and it can be also very obvious, right? As well, it can be really subtle signs and words and things not being said, but it can also be, very obvious in how someone's body shudders, clenches up, goes stiff, goes limp, all those different types of responses.
Yeah.
So as we shift gears into, my next thoughts is kind of like, it's a very broad question, and probably have a couple of questions about this. It's like, what can we do? What can men do in relationship with women, right? With a woman, if maybe they know they've experienced sexual trauma and they've seen some of the signs that we've spoken about. How can a man be? How can he show up that can really, create the best and most beautiful sexual experiences for himself and for her and for the two of them together? I think I'll start with Amy this time.
Yeah, I could feel different things, and I'm excited to hear Amelia's as well. I think we could just really riff on this and create this beautiful cauldron of gifts. And I want to add to what Amelia shared, that tender experience of her reactivated trauma and her boundaries being crossed. And I've been triggered in sexual space significantly at least once for the past 3 years, like since I've been doing this work, like a significant response in my body. And it's like, there's no one to blame. It may be a slightly different scenario from Amelia's situation, but just to say, like, there is not a place that you're going to come to where your body is not going to respond ever to something, you know. And it's about like understanding how to move through it, having the tools to move through it, being, you know, connecting to people who can support that. So yeah, I just wanted to share that, and then come back to the question of what a man can do to support their partner. Is that the question, David? Sorry?
Yeah.
What a man can do to support their partner who's experienced sexual trauma. The first thing to be aware of is that I think pretty much every woman that you're going to meet is going to have some sort of sexual trauma, or going to be having some, you know, have access to some of those sort of symptoms or responses during sex and intimacy. And so the first thing is like opening up a conversation, right? Really having communication about sex, like understand, like getting curious about people's sexual experiences, you know, as much as they want to share, as much as they don't, you know, needs, desires, boundaries, having boundary conversations, like really having boundary conversations, not just like, oh my God, I'm about to rip your clothes off. Any boundaries? Any boundaries? No, good. No, really talking about it. Like, what does it feel like to be you in your body? What is it, you know, what feels too much? What feels too little? And like, I want to say then two really specific things. Go slow. Like, because the times, those 3 instances that I speak to in the last 3 years, 3 significant moments where I've then had to like use all my tools to come out of my, like my trigger response, it was too fast. And sex and what I mean is not like I was being penetrated too fast. Things moved too quickly in the moment, and I couldn't even catch myself, and I agreed to something that I wasn't actually okay with because I was a bit under-resourced, and you know, these different things happen, and they just happen too quick. And that will happen, but if you're coming from it as like, you know, you can't ever eradicate those moments is what I'm saying. But if you're coming at it as in like, let's create a trauma-informed sex space, if you like, go slow. Everybody's going too fast. And when you go too fast, you go into default. You go into default mode. You go into the unconscious. You start operating from your trauma responses, right? And it's when you're too quick to catch the moment. Have check-ins during sex. Is this okay for you? How are you feeling? Ask permission. This is what's one of the most healing things that has happened on my journey when I started having like conscious sex and conscious communication, is partners who asked me for permission before penetrating. It is a fucking game changer for a woman who's just had like so much sort of penetration when I've been like not been conscious as in like drugs and alcohol, or not been like in full permission because it's just happened and I haven't even really been asked, or, you know, it's just, you know, that's traumatic in itself. Rewriting that by asking and giving me the power, because penetration is really fucking vulnerable. Like, you're actually being like, you know, you're like, you know, impaled, if you like, in the most beautiful, pleasurable, wonderful way, but you have to be surrendered in a way, right? You have to be open to receive that in your body, right? Ask if you can enter, like, and so you give the woman the power to receive, right? Rather than you're just taking and she's allowing, right? There's this wheel of consent, which is a beautiful field of work by Betty Martin. And there's, you know, we don't, just because somebody thinks they're giving, it doesn't mean that they're, you know, doing a wonderful thing and we're in consent. And just because somebody's the one that's like on the other end receiving, doesn't mean that they're getting all the wonderful pleasure. There can be some really murky lines there, right? So, you know, bringing in those questions, it's so beautiful to be asked permission for everything. Be asked if you can kiss someone before you kiss them. You know, I think we live on this notion of like, oh, what about spontaneity and fun? Trauma isn't fun, you know? And it's not fun doing things to people that don't actually want that being done to them. And it's best to know, you know, no man wants to be penetrating someone that doesn't want it. So it's best to like get over that feeling of awkwardness around asking, and just ask.
And
Yeah.
I'm just going to jump in there. That's a really powerful point. And I, you know, from my work with men, is all the men I've experienced, right, is they don't want to be penetrating. They don't want to be doing anything to a woman that she doesn't want. It's a really important part. And obviously, I can only speak about the men that I've had contact with, right? And it is a really important piece. It's like the communication, the check-ins, the permission. These are really, and they're really tiny things you can do, right? Like just saying just before penetration, like, hey, like, would you like me to penetrate you? Or, you know, way back before that, like, I'd really love to kiss you. Can I kiss you? You know, these are really tiny things that can be super sexy and really beautiful. And they don't have to kill the spontaneity. There's this, I think it's, what's her name? Esther Perel says, and I like this quote. She was like, sex is never spontaneous because one person's always thinking about it before the other person is. One of you's planning it, right? One of you is secretly scheduled it in your head, or, you know, maybe you're going to a date and you're thinking, I wouldn't mind having sex tonight. Already, one of you's planning it. One of you's planning it in your mind, right? It doesn't really exist, this spontaneous nature. So if you're enjoying this episode, when we talk about how men can connect with women that have experienced sexual trauma, particularly in relationship and sexual situations, there's probably some man or even a woman or a couple, you know, that would really do with this information, that could really enhance their relationship and their ability to connect with each other. Send it to them. You know, pay it forward, share the love, aid and help your fellow friends, family members, and even old partners. Really do them the favor, do them the service of sending them a podcast like this that can really help them in what they're trying to cultivate in their life.
I loved what Amy said about going slow. Like that for me was like, I was like, yes, number one, absolutely going slow. And the other thing that I would say is like, these conversations are big, right? Like we are rewiring our way of relating to intimacy and pleasure and sex in a way that we never have before. You know, we like in films, the way that we saw sex as like a 3-second from start to finish. They didn't have conversations about boundaries and consent. And the sensation that we can feel in the body when we have these conversations is huge. And it can cause us to shut down. It just feels too much. So what I would recommend is like learning about holding sensation in your body. How can you self-soothe in the moment as a guy? Like when your partner is telling them something that feels a lot for their system. It could be like a tiny bit traumatic to have these conversations initially, because, you know, receiving information from your partner as to how she likes to be touched, or, you know, it's so new. And I think to kind of give permission that when you start to relate in this way, there is a lot of sensation, and it is new, and it's exciting, and there's permission, and but it's also, you know, rewiring your neural pathways to do this in a way that's safe and consensual, and it's not just going straight for penetration, having an orgasm, you know, within 5 seconds. You know, it's slowness, it's discovering each other's bodies. It's how about we wait 2 months before we have penetration and we just learn about each other's bodies? How about we spend one night just touching each other's hands? Like the amount of sensation and pleasure that you can get just from that is enormous. And we're so conditioned to go straight from 0 to 100 in like the first or second day or third day or whenever. But how can you prolong the process? How can you make it a really sacred discovery of each other rather than it being just so quick? You know, as Amy was saying, you know, it's this like, you know, entering somebody's body is huge. Like you're actually entering somebody's body. Like it's so intimate. And it's almost just been completely, we become so desensitized through porn and the media, and it's just become something that, well, it's been conditioned into everybody's mind that this is how it should be, when actually we've been shown a slice of the pie, like, right? Like normal way that we see sex and intimacy. It's not really intimate, but is like this tiny slice of the pie when actually we've got this whole pie to explore. The body is a pleasure playground. Like you can orgasm from your toe. When you can explore the sensitivities and the in each other's bodies. And something that I want to reflect back on from earlier on in the conversation is that the closer you get with somebody, the safer you feel with somebody, the more connected you feel with somebody, the deeper the more your trauma can tend to surface. So I had a client that was with her partner for like 3 years, and they started exploring sacred sexuality and tantra like in the towards the end of their second year together. And she was having these, because she felt so safe, she was having these big releases of trauma because she felt so safe and because she felt so met. That trauma felt safe enough to be seen and heard and felt. And so that's something that I also wanted to bring to the conversation. It's not just at the beginning of the relationship thing. It's something that can appear, the trauma needs safety to be felt, to be experienced. Like it just won't, it won't release if it doesn't feel safe in your body or when you're relating with somebody. And so I felt that was important to share as well. If you're listening to this and you're exploring this and you've been with your partner for a long time, there may be situations where your partner might shake uncontrollably or cry uncontrollably or might have a flashback and it's not because you've done something wrong, it's almost because you've done something right, because they feel so safe with you. And that's really what we're aiming to be for each other, is these safe harbors for each other to feel the depths of and the heights of life and intimacy and pleasure and connection, not this kind of carnal fucking just to get to the orgasm. Like it's mad. We've got these like we wear these binoculars that have these very specific scenarios that played out when there's just so much. And the best sex I ever had, there wasn't even any penetration. Just to put that out there. Like there's just, and I don't even think I've had the best sex of my life yet, but that's not, it's so much can happen before penetration is even on the cards.
And I can just talk from my own experience as a man. It's like, it kind of starts with listening, it starts with being able to just listen to your partner, being present with them when they're talking about their life, their experiences. I can think back to this in my probably earlier 20s, the number of times that women would share with me that they'd had, they've experienced sexually traumatic experiences. And it really shaped how I had sex after that, because I was like, wow, this is, I was 25, 26 years old. And I was like, man, I keep hearing about this thing. Wow, fuck. And it really impacted, how quickly I moved, how I listened, how present I was, how I touched a woman, all of these things, because I was like, there's no rush here. I talked to a lot of men about this, and we both mentioned going slow is really important. And I've talked to a lot of guys and I'm like, why do you feel you need to rush? And there's an anxiety for a lot of men. So they get into a sexual experience, it starts to happen, and then their own anxieties start to kick in, fear about staying hard, being good enough, comparisons to men they've been with before, fears about, if the woman likes them, or all these, and those kind of take over, and they create this rush and this speed that happen, which actually takes him out of the moment, right? It actually puts a man into a position where he's almost dangerous, right? Because he's no longer present to the moment. He's preoccupied with his fears and his worries and his concerns. So he's no longer feeling the moment and feeling the woman he's with. That can also happen when a man, in my experience personally, and also men I've spoken to, when a man gets completely overtaken by lust. Because again, he's not in the moment with the person he's with. He's in his own feelings and his experience and his kind of fantasy of what should be happening or is actually happening. And this is why that going slow communicating, asking can be so powerful. You know, I think back to, there was a point in my mid-20s where I became very afraid of that. I could be accused of rape. It became a really thing for me. Like, I was really afraid of it. And I kind of enacted this weird rule where if I was with a woman and we were about to have sex, I wouldn't move any further until she said to me, can you get a condom? And then I'd put the condom on, and then I wouldn't do anything. And I would wait for her to take her hand and to put it in, or at least tell me, like, oh, are you going to put it in? That was often what I was met with. Like, or is there a reason why you're waiting? I'm like, oh, you know, because I was just like, I want to be really sure that this is what she wants, you know? And I'm sure there's a few times in those days where I didn't do that, where there was probably drink and drugs, alcohol and so forth involved. But my intention was like, I need to slow this down. I don't need to have sex. And I think that's a big part. It's like we get into this state as men often is like, oh, I need this sex. I better get this sex before it disappears, or she changes her mind, or she no longer wants me. She's no longer attracted to me. I know that's something that come up for men as well. And like, their intentions are not malicious, but it's like the fear and the worry and anxiety takes over their minds in the moment that makes them go in directions they wouldn't necessarily want to go.
I could feel when you shared that story, I could feel my whole body was like just feeling this expansion of, you know, there's such a beautiful like quality within the feminine, is the longing. It's like the longing, like when you feel this like longing to be penetrated, like that is such a kind of indicator of like safety and embodiment and the amount of, it's just so like refreshing to hear that from you. And I feel like this is a bit healing for me as well to kind of to hear that from you, and it really speaks to this like this whole like reimagining our sex lives, like from this new point, you know, from this new not necessarily new, but like we're so wired for it to be a certain the way that we've seen it, and this invitation to create a different story for yourself of how you want sex to be, and how you want to relate with your partner based on conversations like this. Like these are the conversations that awaken people to a different way of relating with each other.
I just want to add, and I do this with the women that I work with, is like redefining sex and intimacy. Like for heterosexual couples, it's like P and V, penis and vagina. And then you have this whole thing of like, how many times are you having sex a week? Like, and what does that mean about our relationship? And, you know, really like unplucking from all of that and, you know, redefining sex, because, you know, when the whole thing is riding on this penis in vagina, and, you know, when I speak to this like trauma response being a freeze and numbness in the body, for a lot of women, penetration is not that enjoyable unless it is combined with other things, or it's come at the build-up or the heightenedness and the arousal level where they're ready to receive it, right? Where the, you know, a longing to receive is like the body saying, okay, yeah, I'm ready. Like how many, you know, it'd be interesting, you know, to explore like how much longing there is in the relationship for sex, like and how can you create space for that? I know, David, you've both studied tantric approaches, you know, and I have various different views about some of them, but you know, that polarity of like space, like to create charge. And, you know, I'm speaking a little bit outside of trauma terms, but actually, you know, giving the female, the woman who's experienced trauma space to invite in, to be invited in to the body, be invited into intimacy, right? And giving the space, like opening up a space and creating a space for that to happen. And yeah, coming off that penis in vagina as like the ultimate end goal. And like, I would like, in a very literal sense, sitting down and saying, what are the other ways we can explore, like being present and intimate and like physical contact? You know, I don't know who said it, but there's this notion of foreplay beginning after the last orgasm, but let's just say after the last sexual encounter, and like letting your whole relationship be about creating safety and intimacy rather than just this like, we're in a relationship and we have sex and we haven't had sex, but we're in a relationship. And, you know, like having, like just expanding it out, like the listening, the emotional connection, like the opening up of the heart that creates safety. The check-ins, you know, exploring different ways of touch, you know, creating space for longing and inviting each other in, all those things.
And all of those things create such a fertile ground for like the most amazing sex and connection and intimacy. Like it's like you're planting all these beautiful seeds in between the actual act of having sex, and it makes the whole experience so much richer.
I've just got one more thing to add as well. Like the importance of receiving intimate touch without those fingertips having an ulterior motive to get somewhere. Because that, for somebody who's not ready to be penetrated, who's got trauma or otherwise just is not in that space, will shut down any physical intimacy. If the driving force of your intimate touch is to get inside the vagina, then that is going to be felt. And then it's going to close off all avenues to intimacy. Because if, as a woman, you know that your partner's only sort of kissing you or touching you because they want to get, you know, X equals Y, and you're not in the space for Y, which most women aren't until they get there. A lot of women, they don't know until they get there. But if there's the expectation is in the air of that, it's going to, you know, have them just avoiding that, pushing that back, shutting that down, and not wanting to even open the space because of the loadedness of physical intimacy in that context.
And I'd also add to that. So I just want to add to that one thing that's beautiful, Amy, but also there can be an overriding of how you're feeling, that you might be shutting down, but you want to please your partner. And so you're creating more and more armor or more and more defenses to feeling truly how you feel in the moment. And so it's really like the intention of how you're touching. Like, what is your intention with this touch? Like, if your intention is to touch them and then to have sex, like, name that so that your partner has the opportunity to say no. If you just want to touch them because you want them to experience your touch and pleasure without any ulterior motive, say that so that your partner's body can know what to expect.
And I was going to say is that there's a conversation I had recently with a man, and he was finding his partner's retreating. She wants less and less sex. And, you know, I went through this kind of conversation piece with him as being like, okay, what's been her experience? Like, does your touch always have this, does she receive your touch as you wanting sex? Like, if you kiss her in the middle of the day, is she receiving that as like, oh, this is his way to start the process? And he was like, shit, that's what's been happening over time. Like, anything I do that could potentially lead to sex or has in the past, he starts to move away from. And I said to him, I was like, okay, I wanted to do two things. I was like, one, I want you to start a mindful masturbation practice. So you're used to holding lust and excitement in your body and not needing to do anything with it, just having it and being with it. And the second one is I want you to bring passion without obligation, or passion without need. So that could be like just kissing your partner in the middle of the day and then being like wandering off back to your office, you know, because I think, as both of you have said there, what happens is so often for a lot of men that sex is this very linear thing, right? We start with the touching, then the touching leads to this, and, you know, it might be massage, and there's always this kind of stairway to penetration. And, you know, anyone who knows that, you know, can fit a nice pattern will go, oh, I know this pattern. And, well, I'm now being kind of front loaded with this, almost like if you kiss me, you're basically saying, do I want to have sex? So in that moment, I have to make a decision right then and there. And if the man's response sometime has been frustration or anger or annoyance or sulking or anything like that, that's not really a free choice in that moment for her, right? Because she's like, oh, I can have sex I might not want to, but then he's not going to be upset or complaining or sulking. But if I say no, I also have to deal with his upset and complain and sulking. And it's to bring this, kind of hearing you both say it / allude to it. It's like bringing passion, kiss, love, touch, massage, but without any obligation or any ulterior motive of what has to happen afterwards.
And something like having like a passionate kiss in the kitchen and like feeling that eros in your body, like that life force energy in your body, and holding that in your body for like the whole day is so enlivening, and it's so like nourishing, and it's like life force energy. You just have like a gorgeous kiss, and then like you're holding that sensation in your body, and it's that's part of it as well. It's like that's part of the whole experience of intimacy and connection, and how can you hold that sensation?
And I think, if there's one partner, we're talking about the man in this instance, but it could work in both ways, that is wanting more sex from the other, it can be kind of off-putting to the one on the receiving end of that, or like there's somebody seemingly kind of like wanting sex all the time and the other not. That can actually push you back. And I know this is not necessarily in the context of trauma, but it just feels important to voice. It can kind of like be like this person has a need that they're putting all on you. And it's not about the sex, because you can meet that need. You can go and masturbate. So I'd really explore like, what is it about? Normally it's like, I want to feel bonded to my partner. I want to feel some intimacy, and that's the only way I know how. And it's like, explore that then, and explore how that can work both ways. Because, when there's like this urgency for sex from their partner who's not in that space, there's a need there that's getting really projected onto the partner. And of course, we want to have beautiful sex with our partner. But when there's such a kind of like missing or mismatch in desire there, like what's really being wanted? Like what's under that surface of that mismatch? What are you really desiring? And that's when you get like really authentic with each other. And that's when you kind of like crack below the ice, and like, you actually release more life force and energy into the relationship by being true, right? And exploring those deeper caverns within ourselves and bringing them to the table and bringing them into the relationship.
Yeah. I have one question that's kind of come up out of what we said. And it's something that I've interacted with a few men who've experienced this. Is like where they have a partner who's experienced sexual trauma in the past, and sex is very difficult, right? It happens very seldom. Their partner is unable to really know how to be touched and what they like, and the reactions can be quite severe. And the man loses a lot of confidence for even approaching sex as a topic or something to do, and actually goes into a point where relationships become kind of almost sexless, because the topic of sex is so charged, and the man feels such a lack of confidence or a lack of ability in that area when being with their partner, that it just becomes a really strained part of the relationship. And I just wondered what your take, the two of you, would be on like how a couple can kind of work together to moving towards the sort of sex and intimacy they want in this instance.
Yeah, I can share. I feel a lot of just compassion for like the men listening and the men out there, within this conversation that maybe hasn't been brought through yet in this chat, because we've been focusing on sort of the women's sexual trauma. But also I want to speak like trauma both ways, because, men may have experienced sexual trauma for sure, but they would have experienced developmental trauma. So like when their partner's like not wanting to be intimate with them or have sex with them, or like telling them they're doing it wrong, like it's gonna like trigger all these sort of like rejection wounds, abandonment wounds. Like there's so much there, and they need support and being seen and held also, right? So there's real complexity. It can get really clunky and chewy, particularly like the example that you shared, David, like the confidence has been knocked, right? And, my first thought is that the responsibility does lie on the person whose body is experiencing the trauma first and foremost. It relies, it's not down to the men to heal the woman that they're with, right? And maybe just sharing that may bring back some confidence, because then they can kind of be aware and understand, and they are a sovereign being in a co-created relationship also, right? So they have wants, needs, and desires that I would be really mindful if those are being compromised to a point of, kind of non-existence in a relationship over somebody who is experiencing trauma, a trauma response. And so if they are feeling that, I would maybe even suggest they both ensure that their partner has a support network outside of just that part, outside of just him, right? That's so important. We can't be our everything to our partner. He can't be her healer and his lover. Those two things are, whilst I said healing can happen within relationship, your partner is not your healer, right? That's or your therapist or your coach, right? That's a very different thing. You're two equal beings co-creating this relational bubble. That's my feel so far. I want to hear what Amelia has to share on that.
The first thing that came to me was get support. Like, as a couple, get support. Like, independently, as Amy was saying, make sure you have your own support networks. But there's nothing shameful about getting therapy as a couple to navigate these really crunchy, difficult times, because sometimes it's good to have a mediator. Sometimes it's good to have a mediator or somebody who can really help you to kind of translate and understand what's happening, because it can be so intense in the moment. And we can have these reactions, and we can say things in the moment that we don't mean, and to be able to speak through it with a professional, I think at that point is really important. And I think maybe it doesn't need to be 100 sessions, maybe 3 or 4 sessions with a trained professional could save months, even years down the line. And I think I think like generally people are getting more aware of therapy and getting help and support, but I think in the relating sphere, I think it's when they've got to a point like that where there is so much disconnection and kind of activation at the same time. Hi, Bon.
Sorry, she's having a little bark. I could see my camera lighting up. We might have to put her out. Hi. She's the needy one.
Yeah. Oh. She, and I think actually getting professional help, I think when there's been, when it gets to that point where you can't relate with each other in a regulated, kind, compassionate, understanding way, when there's too much withdrawal, when there's too much trauma, when especially when the man has kind of feels this lack of confidence, as a woman, we kind of want the man to be the space holder. Like the roles interchange, but I think when a man is feeling disempowered sexually, it can be a very challenging territory. And I think to get professional help would just be really, really would be really supportive.
Yeah. And I think that last piece you said there about the sport, but also about being dysregulated. When two people are together and they're dysregulated, then it can be really explosive in not necessarily the most positive ways for them, especially in the realm of sex and intimacy.
Yeah, it can be explosive, or you just disconnect, and it's the breaking of that bubble, right? It's the kind of floating off in separate places. Yeah. And that's like, sorry, that it's like the opposite of a safe space, I suppose. And, of course, we're all going to get dysregulated in our relationships, and there's going to be times when both are dysregulated and but both need tools to come back into connection with self and then other. And there may be times when we hold space for our partner who's more dysregulated and vice versa. But one person can't adopt the role of holding space for dysregulation solely for their partner, and that being the dynamic. I don't think that that's a healthy relationship.
Something that I'd like to add to that is that the more you kind of explore conscious connection, conscious relating, the more tools that you get, the more you're able to understand your nervous system, the more you're able to resource, the easier these conversations become. And that's something that I've definitely learnt myself, is like having these structures, having these ways of creating containers of relating where there's like a formula for like how you communicate and how you come back to yourself, and the more you are able to understand about sensation in the body and hold these big conversations and learn about holding each other's vulnerabilities and holding space for each other, I think it gets easier and easier the more you understand your partner, and the more you understand that there's really amazing ways of creating safety for each other that allow for the flowering, allow for the vulnerability, allow for the tenderness, which has been mind-blowing for me. I mean, until like 4 years ago, I don't know how I ever related before having the tools that I have now. And they really serve as a support for the flourishing of a relationship, to navigate these highs and these lows and these tender points and these crunchy points.
Any of the tools, things you can name, like I'm thinking of in terms of communication, like I teach a lot of my clients around imago dialogue being something that's really important. Talk to them about nonviolent communication, somatic practices like breath work, eye gazing and things like that to bring back into connection. But maybe there's a few more that the two of you could name that may be useful to listeners.
One that I love is emptying the basket. I don't know if that's the technical term for it. But having a space where you set a timer for like 3 minutes and you allow your partner just to share what's alive for them, what they need to share, like before going into a more sensitive conversation, but really kind of allowing your partner to speak, allowing them to share what's alive for them, and just being witnessed, not being fixed or advised or changed, and then that person says, thank you for sharing. And then the other person shares. And so it's this really beautiful opportunity to be witnessed and to share. And then quite often, once that person has said, oh, I get really frustrated when you don't put the bins out because I feel X, Y, and Z, that person can just witness it. And then sometimes that energy just leaves. So I'd say that's something that I've shared with clients. I've also used personally a lot, is just kind of like emptying the basket of what could be in the way of you relating authentically.
I feel like you've both shared all the things I would use. I'm seeing if there's anything that I could add. I guess relational check-ins, so a space outside of a sexual space where you can speak about these things. It's like a structured, semi-structured conversation, but not with like yes, no answers, where you can just explore things. The important thing to go into that is to have tools to regulate yourself if tricky things come up. And a tool of regulation is also knowing your boundaries, being able to say, right, I need some space right now and I need to come back. I'll come back in an hour, or this has been a lot for me. I need to do this, and then come back into the connection or into the conversation. So there's a lot of sort of self-awareness that is needed for this kind of relating that can take years to develop. And something I want to share, which probably just opens up a bit more of a minefield, but it just feels important, is that I know you and I have. All of us have done trainings where there's like these really beautiful structured like conversations and check-ins, and I think they're really good as a tool but not the rule. And I'm going to apply like a wisdom teaching from Maya Luna, another like super powerful woman who speaks like to the deep feminine, and you got to understand that there is a conversation happening underneath the words that we are having that is not making it to the surface. right? And you can be saying yes and meaning no, and you know, saying you want this but meaning you want that. And there is this undercurrent conversation between our bodies, between our psyches in relationship, and that's the feminine that's happening. So, you know, what we can take from that is using these structured conversations and check-ins and these tools, but not holding our partner to them. Not like, but you said that this and now you mean this. And, you know, like really allowing for that undercurrent, deep feminine conversation to have value as well and to have space.
Mm. Mm.
Mm.
Because,
sorry, you know, like sex and intimacy is like complex human behavior. And like, as much as we want to like jam it into like a label and a structure and a, you know, you got to understand that it's never going to be that way, you know, and these just provide like beautiful tools to move into it. And in that as well, allow the space for the magic, you know, like the things that we've said, like the slow and the presence, you know, maybe just, and for the vulnerable, I don't know what I'm doing, you know, sharing that with your partner. I feel scared. I feel like I'm lost, you know.
Yeah. That vulnerability piece, Amy, is so key, I think. It's such a heart opener and a way of connecting in a way. I think we can get so kind of, things will get so heightened, and so I've got to do this perfectly and I've got to share this perfectly, and you know, this conditioning that, you know, of being perfect. And I think just saying, I don't know, I'm messy and magical and fucked up and fabulous and all of it. And I know definitely in my one of my big faults in my earlier relationships was this inability to be vulnerable. I always had to be like, I was the businesswoman and the you know, I had all these masks on. Like, to be vulnerable with my partner was just like not on the cards. And it's like the secret sauce. It's such a, I'm so glad you brought that up, Amy, because I think it's such an important point.
I just have another thing to add in that feels important.
Another mic drop.
It's definitely something that I'm bringing into where I'm teaching people, and it's not a great thing to hear because it doesn't fit into this nice solution focused pocket. But, you know, like, safety, you know, is not created by going away and doing a few breaths and coming back. Like, you know, if you've experienced trauma and you feel unsafe in your body, it can take your whole life to kind of navigate safety. And it's like exploring that in any given moment. And it can also take like completely changing your whole lifestyle, you know, how you relate, who you relate to, the things that you do, the things you eat, the places you go, the friends that you have in your life, your relationship with your parents, the boundaries that you put. Like, we're talking about sex, but as you both know, like, this is, you know, sex is life. And, you know, if you want to feel safety in the bedroom, you're going to be wanting to know how to feel safe in your entire life. And it, you know, safety is not as simple as let's just use a few tools to regulate. They definitely can help. Like I said, like tool, but not the rule. But, you know, when we talk about sexual trauma, there's a lot that needs to go into to you know, even maybe just to be able to identify that you don't feel safe in your body, right? It's not always clear if you don't feel safe, right? If you don't have that attunement and connection to your body.
Yeah, how do you even know what safety... I remember when I first started this, I didn't even know... I thought I was safe. I thought I felt safe. And then the more and more I sort of understood what safety felt like, I just was just so shocked. And now, even now, this is an ongoing adventure. It's not, you know, it unfolds and unfolds and unfolds. And I'm definitely not sat here having mastered it by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm definitely more attuned to the subtleties of my body. And that's taken, you know, 5 years. And and we are, you know, we talk about sex in a very free and open way in this podcast, but it hasn't been for generations and generations and generations. Like, we're not just talking about, your experiences of sex. We're talking about all the women, all the men that have come before you and their experiences and how that's held in your cells. So we're really doing a big job at the moment to help people to come home to their bodies and their pleasure and their sexuality in a way that's authentic to them, that is not imprinted in our cells. Like we don't have this cellular memory of safe, intimate, vulnerable, expansive, ecstatic, blissful sex. That was like thousands of years ago. So we have teachings, we have things that we can touch upon, we can call upon, but it's like we're steering a humongous ship right now, all of us individually and collectively, to embody and experience a new way of relating, a new way of having sex, a new way of connecting with our partners, ourselves first and foremost, and our partners. And so maybe there's a bit of a permission slip there to be like, you're doing really well. Like even if you're listening to this podcast, even if you're just listening to this podcast, like, well done. Like you're on the path, and those ups and downs and 20 steps forwards and 50 steps back, but you're on the path. You have a willingness to be supportive to yourself and to your partner, and that's everything.
And we've come such a long way on that path because as you said, like there's not a history of this, our history is of like not talking about it, not being something you discuss publicly, not talking about your problems, not talking about your trauma, suppressing all of it, pretending it's not there. And just moving into this space of being like, this is something I want to learn about. This is something I want to be kind of more informed about. And I want to, as you both said, come home to the body and feel self and feel what pleasure is and feel what safety is and feel what desire is. That in itself is like, it's generational trauma work, in action. It takes your lineage, your being forward multiple generations just in starting on this path.
And I want to sort of add that, I don't believe that we're speaking about men holding space, but, I'm not convinced that men feel that safe in their bodies in sex and intimacy, and you can't hold space if you're not in your body. Or men, collectively, we're disconnected from our bodies, right? Because our bodies are the emotion, the feeling, the sensation. Yet culturally, it is more accepted for a female to be connected to that stuff. Yet we're still disconnected. So not only it's almost like twofold, the two steps for men, like you're actually like conditioned to be disconnected. You're conditioned to be in your head, and even like when we see like the masculine, it's like in the head. So we're really asking you to step into your feminine, be connected to your body, because you really have to kind of hold space and sense what's happening, and be in your masculine and hold that point of, and it's not tidy like that, life isn't tidy like that. And just want to give that permission. Again, sometimes the things I say, they're not solution focused, they're just observations and feelings around what's happening. And we and to maybe take from that, it's like we don't have to have a solution to things. You can just navigate and be with what's occurring. And I want to just reiterate, like, to that men may not feel safe in their body or feel connected to their body, and that's important, not just for them to be space holders, but for them to be experiencing what they desire, like deep pleasure and intimacy as well.
And I think there's such an exquisiteness to this adventure of coming home to your body and your pleasure and your sexuality, and in all of its awkwardness and crunchy bits and cringy bits and oh my god, why did I say that bit, and Like, oh, there's so much aliveness there. Like when you're in that cauldron, it's like, oh God, this is real life. Like I am living right now. I'm not now. I'm feeling this excruciating burn of shame as I share this vulnerable part of me. Like that is aliveness. You're alive. You're living. You're experiencing the magic that this crazy experience of life is. And I think when you can tune into that, it makes it like a curious exploration of the spectrum of being a human.
I laugh just because me and Amelia are such intensity junkies. And so I don't mean to drag you. Sorry, I mean, I don't mean to speak for your experience, but I was just like, oh, I resonate. I'm like, yes, I feel shame and all this pain because I'm alive. And and I'm going to take it to my bedroom and I'm going to like orgasm over this. Set my dog off. But it is like, it's like when you actually connect to your pelvis, it is like, God, I'm on fire. And like, what can I do with this fire? And how can I alchemize it? And how can I sublimate it? And yeah, like the big teaching in my practitioner training at the moment is like commit to the current of aliveness without judging what it is. You know, like whatever it is that's surging through your body, just commit to it. Yeah.
Feel the fire in my pelvis.
A beautiful quote from the episode. And I also just want to bring in, you know, it's like as men, all this stuff we talk about, you know, being messy and being unsure and feeling all these range of emotions and feelings, like that's also there for you too, right? Like a lot of men feel through the you know, very masculine and feminine teachings of like, men, we have to be like holding space and we have to be able to be like clear with our words and completely clear of our intentions and all that. But it's that's very limiting because there is this feminine part of all of us that isn't linear, that is chaotic, right? And it's important for us to, in our relationships, also make space for men to be that way, right? Because, you know, as much as I know there's a lot of great men out there in the world that want to be these wonderful space holders and holding all storm that comes in their way, sometimes the storm is you, and the storm in you needs somewhere to rage and feel and express and bring your unsureness and all the stuff that's there. It doesn't fit. You don't have to be this wall of consciousness and this impeccable container all of the time.
And I think when there's an acceptance and a welcoming from that from the man or the woman, like there's like this is me and this is how I am in the moment, rather than sort of bottling it down. And I think when there's like, I need to you know, release some rage, or, you know, and I don't, you know, you don't need to worry about it, but I just need to, you know, move my body. I need to like some force. I need to push against your hands or something, you know, like a somatic kind of experience of what's moving through your body. And we get so in the mind that we have to talk about it. Like, what about like rolling around on the floor and getting really kind of in your bodies? And like, that's a really beautiful way to communicate too, and play fighting and, you know, just kind of getting primal with it, because that's also a really beautiful way of resolving things. But, you know, as we've been, you know, cut off from the neck down, it's like, oh, you know, I remember I had a friend and we had this like slightly heated argument on Hampstead Heath, and we ended up like play fighting it out, like rolling around on the floor and like being really primal with each other. And then this like old couple came past and they said, "Are you okay? Are you two okay?" And we just like burst out laughing because we were just rolling around, and it's like, it's so unseen and unheard of to be like that. And this is a whole different conversation, but I think we're animals. Like, ultimately we're animals, and to have that primal connection can be so healing. So if you see two people rolling around Hampstead Heath growling at each other, it's probably me.
Yeah. I'm going to add, I'm checking the time, but there's so much coming through. But, you know, this notion of like primal and getting in the body is like why I think there's such a hyper focus on sex, because it's like the one space where we can actually just get into our body and get into that energy, because actually there is nowhere else, you know, we don't really have any other outlets, particularly as adults, you know, where we, you know, when I think of sexual energy and like when we're younger, because we do feel sexual energy from the off, you know, like jumping around on a trampoline or a bouncy castle is like a real, you know, and that ecstatic, you know, running around, you know, chocolate all over your face, just that's like this ecstasy energy, right? And we don't really have that as adults, you know, we don't really have a lot of spaces where we can do that. So like finding spaces where you can like connect to your sexual energy outside of a sexual space with a partner can be really beautiful. It might even be that you need to call it something different, because actually just the sexualization of things can be too much for, you know, when we're experiencing trauma. And I also just want to add that sometimes there's nothing you can do to be a safe person for someone who doesn't feel safe in their body, right? Or that you just activate on some, again, in that feminine current, you activate something that feels deeply unsafe to them, right? And I think we can kind of beat ourselves up and, you know, and I say this, I've been really exploring this notion of safety. It was a big theme in my work and it still is, but it's changing form. Like I used to sort of say, I provide a safe space. I don't know if I provide a safe space for you, because I don't know what your nervous system experiences in front of me. I actually might be deeply triggering and then I'm not a safe space for you, right? And, you know, it's the same in relationships. Sometimes our nervous systems, and again, it's like this undercurrent, may just be communicating in a way that's unsafe. And we're trying to do all the right things and we just can't. And I just say that because like sometimes things just are, and we can't always fix our way out of something or work our way out of something. And we can't put that pressure on ourselves or that blame or that responsibility, right? We can do what we can. And ultimately, sometimes these things are just happening and we can't get to it to kind of resolve it.
It feels like a really gentle way to come to a close of the conversation, or the glorious conversation. It's really weaved through multiple areas. And I'm sure the listeners are like, where can they chew on more of your content, work with you, know more about you, do workshops with you? So, Amy, would you like to tell the listeners how they can get more of you?
Yeah, sure. So you can find me on socials, mostly Temple of the Feminine. I currently work with women. If anybody has a query or a question off the back of this, male-bodied, female-bodied, please reach out to me. I can help where I can. I will help where I can. So I work particularly with women. And so at the moment, I'm focusing on training women to do what I do. So practitioner training. So for those who are already working in the healing, space holding space. But I also do the odd sort of workshop and course, and I work one-to-one. Although I'm less focused on that at the moment, there will be spots opening up at some stage. So yeah, just come and find me at Temple of the Feminine. My website has all my podcasts and some free resources, and I write a lot on my socials. So yeah, there's a lot of free content to chew on in there.
You can. So I'm Amelia. Don't know why I just said that. Thought I was going through an introduction there. I'm currently in a bit of a cauldron of transformation. So you can find me at Alchemy with Amelia on Instagram. So if you want to connect with me, ask me questions, I'm very responsive on DMs. I don't currently have a website. I am currently curating a podcast called Temple and Wand, which both of these magnificent people are going to be appearing on. And there's going to be, as an offshoot from that, there's going to be workshops and retreats and experiences all around sacred sexuality, spirituality, mystery and magic. So put Temple and Wand in your diary to look for in about 6 months. And I'm not really taking on one-to-one clients, but if you have a deep desire to work with me, then just send me a DM and we can chat.
Beautiful. And all those details will be down below in that section with all the words in it. Show notes. Got there eventually, didn't I?
All the words.
We're too stunned by the conversation to to get into that logical, technical brain.
Yeah. And I wanted to say, I know these two wonderful ladies would love to hear from you as listeners. It's always a joy to hear from people. And they're like, I listened to this episode and I got this and I learned this. So please feel free to reach out, feel free to reach out to connect, because it is always beautiful to know that what we do makes a difference to people, because sometimes, you feel like you're putting a lot out into the world and sometimes you get very little back on the other side. Yeah. Screaming into the distance.
And then suddenly
this is interrelational work. We're going to need something back.
Somebody messaged me about a month ago saying, oh, I watched this YouTube video of you, and it was like one from me like 3 years ago. And I was so unpolished and it was awful. And she was like, oh, and I really want to work with you. I was like, oh my God, these tentacles, this abyss sometimes reaches people. I also want to celebrate you, David, for initiating this conversation and being just such a champion of men and women and this work. And, it takes a really amazing man to do this, to hold these conversations and to share them, and you're just such a light in this field, and I just really want to celebrate you and thank you for doing this and for inviting us.
Thank you, Amelia.
And I just want to acknowledge, I'm just laughing because this is going to be a never-ending podcast. But you're holding space for men to hold space for women. How beautiful. Thank you on behalf of myself and women everywhere.
Thank you. Thank you very much to the two of you. Big thank you for being here and sharing your experience and your beautiful wisdom. It's been wonderfully enlightening, not just to me, but I'm sure to the listeners. So a huge thank you for you and the work that you do with women as well, both of you. It's truly magical, makes such a difference in the world.
And thank you for Amelia for being my
Yes,
co-woman.
Thank you, Amy, for being a mirror and a reflector and my bestest bud.
Soul sister.
Right.
Sister. I think, I can stop now.
So listeners, thank you very much for listening, and I'll be back with another episode next week. Ciao, ciao. I want to say a big thank you for listening. It's people like yourself that really help get the podcast out into the world. Especially if you're often sharing the episodes and the podcast with people that you feel just could do with listening, right? Can see a different way of being a man, maybe a different way of having dating lives and intimacy and relationships. So I want to say a big thank you. And if maybe after listening to this episode, you think, oh, there's someone actually who could really do with this, please share it with them, share the love. I'm really, really grateful. And if, you want to get in contact with me for any questions, or you want to talk about coaching or any working together, feel free to reach out to me on Instagram @theauthenticman_, or you can email me hello@theauthenticman.net. Thank you very much.